In Southampton County, Virginia, during the suffocating heat of August 1831, 57 white residents died in a span of 48 hours. The official records list their names, their ages, their final moments. But what those records never mention is how the violence began not with rage, but with scripture. How a man who taught himself to read using a stolen Bible became the architect of the bloodiest slave uprising in American history. How the son of an African-born woman who bore ritual scars turned prophecy into revolution. The Commonwealth of Virginia tried to bury this story beneath layers of legal testimony and propaganda. They executed 16 men, sold dozens more to the Deep South, and spent decades rewriting what happened in those 2 days. But court documents, personal letters, and witness statements, many sealed for over a century, reveal something far more complex than the simple narrative of violence the authorities wanted the public to believe. Before we continue with the story of Nat Turner, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. Because stories like this, stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about American history, need to be heard. And leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. Let's uncover together the truth that powerful people worked so hard to conceal. What really happened in Southampton County didn't begin on that August night. It began 31 years earlier, in a small cabin where a woman looked at her newborn son and saw marks that made her weep. Nancy Turner gave birth to her son on October 2nd, 1800, in a rough-hewn cabin on Benjamin Turner's plantation. The birth itself was unremarkable. Virginia in autumn saw countless slave children born into bondage. But what happened immediately afterward would shape everything that followed. Nancy, who had been brought from Africa as a child and still bore the traditional scarification marks of her homeland on her arms, examined her infant son with an intensity that alarmed the older women present. She traced her fingers across his head, his chest, his tiny limbs, searching for something. "He has the marks," she whispered in a language the other slaves didn't fully understand. "The bumps and scars. He is chosen." The other women exchanged worried glances. They knew what happened to slave children whose mothers claimed special destinies for them. Masters didn't tolerate such talk. But Nancy insisted her son bore unusual markings on his body from birth, signs she recognized from the spiritual traditions of her homeland. Whether these marks were real or imagined by a desperate mother seeking meaning in an unbearable existence, no one could say for certain. But Nancy believed with absolute conviction, and she raised Nathaniel with that belief woven into every moment of his childhood. Benjamin Turner, the plantation owner, was a relatively prosperous farmer who worked his land alongside his dozen slaves. He was neither the cruelest nor the kindest of masters. He existed in that vast middle ground of men who accepted slavery as an economic necessity without excessive brutality, but also without moral qualms. His wife, Elizabeth, noticed early that the Turner boy was different from other slave children. While others his age played in the dirt or helped with simple chores, young Nathaniel would sit for hours studying the shapes of leaves, the patterns of shadows, the movements of insects across the ground. When Nathaniel was 3 or 4 years old, he demonstrated an ability that sent ripples of unease through the slave quarters and the main house alike. He described events that had occurred before his birth with such specific detail that older slaves swore he must have witnessed them somehow. He spoke of storms that had destroyed crops in particular years, of a horse that had broken its leg in a specific location, of conversations between people who had died before he was born. His grandmother Bridget, Nancy's mother, who still carried the African name she refused to abandon, encouraged this gift, seeing in it confirmation of Nancy's prophecy. "The boy sees what others cannot," Bridget would say in hushed tones to the other slaves. "The ancestors speak through him." Benjamin Turner heard these stories, and with the casual curiosity of a man whose property had proven interesting, decided to teach the boy to read. This was illegal in Virginia. Teaching slaves to read had been outlawed since 1819, but Turner did it anyway, perhaps amused by the child's intelligence, perhaps motivated by some half-formed notion of Christian duty. He gave Nathaniel access to the family Bible and watched as the boy devoured it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. By the time Nathaniel was 12, he could read and write better than many white children in the county. But more significantly, he had begun to interpret the Bible in ways that made both slaves and masters uncomfortable. He saw in the Old Testament not just stories of faith, but blueprints for resistance. The Israelites' escape from Egypt, David's victory over Goliath, Samson's destruction of the Philistine temple, these weren't just ancient tales to young Nathaniel. They were instructions waiting to be followed. The slaves began coming to him with questions about Scripture. They called him the prophet, in whispers, careful never to let the overseers hear. Nathaniel told them that God had shown him visions in the night, visions of black and white spirits battling in the sky, visions of blood running through the fields, visions of liberation through fire and judgment. He fasted for days at a time, wandering into the woods to pray and, he claimed, to receive direct communication from the divine. "I saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle," he would later testify, "and the sun was darkened. The thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in streams." In 1810, Benjamin Turner died, and the plantation passed to his son Samuel. Nathaniel, now 10 years old, watched as the estate was divided and reorganized. Samuel Turner had no interest in his father's eccentric experiment with an educated slave. He saw Nathaniel as a potential source of trouble. Too intelligent, too influential among the other slaves, too confident in his bearing. But Nathaniel was valuable property, a strong young man who could work hard, and Samuel kept him close, assigning him to work in the fields alongside the others while keeping a wary eye on his activities. During these years, Nathaniel's reputation grew. Slaves from neighboring plantations would find excuses to visit, hoping to hear him preach. He told them that God had revealed to him a great purpose, that he was meant to lead his people to freedom, but that the time had not yet come. He needed a sign, a clear indication from heaven that the moment had arrived. "I was ordained for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty," he told those who would listen. "The signs would be shown to me when the time was right." In 1822, when Nathaniel was 22, Samuel Turner died suddenly, and once again, the property was reorganized. Nathaniel was hired out to John Travis, a wheelwright who had married Samuel's widow. This arrangement, being hired out rather than sold outright, gave Nathaniel a degree of mobility unusual for slaves. He worked in Travis's shop, learning the wheelwright trade, but he also traveled throughout Southampton County, delivering finished work, which allowed him to maintain contact with the network of slaves he had been building for years. The Travis household was smaller, less strictly supervised. Nathaniel found more time to preach, to plan, to wait for his sign. He married a woman named Cherry, who belonged to a nearby plantation, and their forced separation, seeing her only when granted permission, added personal anguish to his theological fury. He watched as families were torn apart by sale, as children were taken from mothers, as men were whipped for the smallest infractions. Each injustice fed the fire of his conviction that divine judgment was coming. By 1825, Nathaniel had experienced what he described as a profound religious vision while working in the fields. He saw drops of blood on the corn, hieroglyphic characters and numbers written in blood on leaves in the woods. Whether these were real phenomena, perhaps tricks of light, plant diseases, his own blood from cuts sustained while working, or hallucinations brought on by fasting and religious fervor, Nathaniel interpreted them as messages from God. The Almighty was preparing him for his mission. He began baptizing followers in the mill pond, performing ceremonies that blended Christian ritual with half-remembered African traditions his grandmother had taught him. White residents occasionally witnessed these gatherings and found them disturbing. The intensity of the singing, the fervor of the prayers, the way the slaves looked at Nathaniel with something approaching worship. But Southampton County had always been relatively peaceful, with none of the organized resistance seen in other parts of the South. The white population saw these religious gatherings as harmless, perhaps even useful in keeping the slaves docile, and focused on heavenly rather than earthly liberation. They were catastrophically wrong. On February 12, 1831, the sun disappeared in the middle of the day. A solar eclipse swept across North America, and in Southampton County, Virginia, slaves and masters alike stood in their yards watching the moon slowly consume the sun. The temperature dropped, birds stopped singing and returned to their roosts. A strange twilight settled over the landscape at noon. Nathaniel Turner stood in the Travis yard, his face turned upward, tears streaming down his cheeks. This was the sign he had been waiting for. After years of visions, prophecies, and preparation, God had finally spoken clearly. The time had come. It was the sign I'd been waiting for, he would later explain. I should arise and prepare myself, and slay my enemies with their own weapons. But Nathaniel didn't act immediately. He was a careful man, methodical in his planning despite the religious fervor that drove him. He spent the next 6 months organizing, recruiting, preparing. He had identified 4 men he trusted completely: Henry Porter, Hark Travis, Nelson Williams, and Sam Edwards. These were not random choices. Each man was strong, determined, and had his own reasons for wanting to break the chains that bound him. Henry had watched his wife sold to a plantation in Georgia 3 years earlier. Hark had been promised freedom by his previous owner, only to have that promise broken when the man died and left him to Travis instead. Nelson bore scars on his back from a whipping that had nearly killed him. Sam had buried 2 of his children, both dead before their 5th birthdays from diseases that might have been treatable if slave children received the same medical care as white children. Nathaniel told them about the eclipse, about his visions, about the divine mandate he had received. More importantly, he told them about his plan. They would strike on the 4th of July, America's Independence Day, a date chosen for its symbolic irony. They would begin at the Travis farm, then move methodically through the county, gathering more followers and weapons as they went. Their ultimate goal was to reach Jerusalem, the county seat, seize the armory there, and spark a wider uprising throughout Virginia and the South. But as July 4th approached, Nathaniel fell ill. Whether this was genuine sickness, a crisis of doubt, or a calculated delay is unknown. The planned uprising was postponed. His followers grew restless, wondering if their prophet had lost his nerve or if God had withdrawn the divine mandate. Then, on August 13th, another sign appeared in the sky. The sun took on a peculiar bluish-green tint that day, a phenomenon caused by atmospheric conditions or perhaps by smoke from distant forest fires. To Nathaniel, confined to his cabin with lingering illness, watching through the small window as the strange light fell across Southampton County, this was God's second message. The delay had been part of the plan. The real moment had now arrived. On Sunday, August 21st, Nathaniel met with his 4 trusted followers in the woods near the Travis property. They gathered at a place they called Cabin Pond, sharing a meal of roast pig that Hark had stolen from his master's smokehouse. As they ate, 2 more men joined them, Jack Reese and Will Francis. Nathaniel had not invited them, and their presence initially alarmed him. But Hark vouched for both men, and Nathaniel accepted their addition to the group. Will Francis was particularly notable. He was a massive man, tremendously strong, who had a reputation for violence. He had killed an overseer in a neighboring county years earlier, but had somehow avoided execution, instead being sold multiple times to masters willing to take a risk on dangerous property. Will listened to Nathaniel's plan with a cold expression, then asked a single question. "When do we start?" "Tonight," Nathaniel replied. "We begin at my master's house at the Travis farm. We take their weapons first, then we move to the neighboring farms. By dawn, we will have an army." They discussed the details as the sun set, and darkness settled over the woods. The plan was simple but required absolute commitment. They would kill quickly and quietly, taking weapons and horses from each farm. They would spare no one who might sound the alarm. Every white person they encountered would be killed, men, women, children. Nathaniel was explicit about this, and his reasoning was theological as much as tactical. God has commanded it, he told them. Just as the Israelites were commanded to destroy the Canaanites utterly, we must remove every potential enemy. This is divine judgment, not murder. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably at this. Killing white men, even killing overseers or masters, was one thing. But women, children. Yet Nathaniel's certainty, his absolute conviction that they were instruments of divine will, overcame their hesitation. They had committed themselves to this course, and there was no turning back. As midnight approached, the 7 men moved silently through the darkness toward the Travis farm. The house was dark, its occupants asleep. A dog barked once, then fell silent. The men approached the door, and Nathaniel tested the latch. It was unlocked. Masters rarely locked their doors in Southampton County, secure in their belief that their slaves were docile and controlled. Nathaniel pushed the door open slowly, and the 7 men entered the house where he had lived and worked for the past 9 years. They crept up the stairs toward the bedrooms, their movements muffled by the thick darkness. The Travis family, Joseph Travis, his wife Sarah, their infant son, and 3 other children from Sarah's previous marriage, slept peacefully, unaware that their world was about to end. What happened next would be recounted in court testimony, newspaper reports, and terrified whispers for generations. The specific details were gruesome enough that even the legal documents tried to soften them. But the essential fact was undeniable. In a matter of minutes, the Travis household was dead. Nathaniel and his men moved through the house systematically, using axes and hatchets because Nathaniel had ordered them to work quietly. Guns would wake the neighbors. When they emerged from the house, their clothes were stained, their hands shaking. Some of the men vomited in the yard, but Nathaniel's voice was steady as he ordered them to search the property for weapons and horses. They found several firearms, ammunition, and 4 horses. They loaded the weapons, mounted the horses, and rode toward the neighboring farm before the sun could rise and reveal what they had done. The rebellion had begun. The Turner group moved through Southampton County with a speed that would later baffle military analysts. Between midnight and dawn on August 22nd, they struck 5 more farms, and with each attack, their numbers grew. Slaves from the attacked plantations joined them, some enthusiastically, some reluctantly, some because they understood that staying behind meant being implicated as conspirators anyway. At the Reese farm, they killed 3 people and gained 4 new followers. At the Turner farm, no relation to Nathaniel despite the shared name, they killed 5 and recruited 6 more. The pattern repeated as they moved from property to property. By sunrise, Nathaniel commanded approximately 15 men, all armed, all riding horses, all committed to the plan, even as its moral weight began to settle on them. The violence was not random. Nathaniel had a specific route planned, targeting farms in a systematic pattern that would allow them to gather the maximum number of followers and weapons before the alarm could spread. But maintaining discipline became increasingly difficult. Some of the newer recruits, fueled by years of rage and abuse, wanted to linger at each farm, to loot and destroy. Nathaniel had to constantly push them forward, insisting that speed was essential. "We must reach Jerusalem before they can organize a defense," he told them repeatedly. "Every minute we waste is a minute they have to prepare." At the Whitehead farm, they encountered Margaret Whitehead, a young woman who had taught some of the local slave children to read in defiance of Virginia law. When Nathaniel hesitated, she had shown kindness to slaves after all. Will Francis did not. The killing was efficient and brutal, and it broke something in several of the men who witnessed it. They were no longer liberators in a righteous war. They were killers, and the distinction between justice and murder was becoming impossible to maintain. Throughout Monday, August 22nd, the group continued to grow. By afternoon, they numbered between 50 and 60 men. Accounts vary, as chaos makes accurate counting impossible. They had killed approximately 60 white residents of Southampton County, moving through the landscape like a terrible storm. Some of the victims were plantation owners, brutal masters whose deaths could be rationalized as justice. but others were small farmers who owned no slaves, poor whites who lived on the margins, children who had committed no sin beyond being born into a particular race at a particular time and place. The alarm finally spread around mid-morning when a boy from one of the attacked farms managed to escape and reach a neighbor's house. Word traveled through the county with the speed of terror. White families began fleeing toward Jerusalem, abandoning their homes and heading for what they hoped would be safety in numbers. The county militia was called out, and riders were sent to neighboring counties requesting reinforcements. By Monday afternoon, Nathaniel's force had grown to its maximum size, but signs of disorganization were evident. Many of the newer recruits were drunk. They had raided the liquor stores at several farms, and maintaining the disciplined march toward Jerusalem became impossible. The column stretched out along the road, with some men lagging far behind, others racing ahead. Nathaniel tried to maintain control, but he was a preacher, not a military commander, and the situation was rapidly deteriorating. At the Parker farm, roughly 3 miles from Jerusalem, they encountered armed resistance for the first time. A group of white men, perhaps a dozen, had barricaded themselves in the house and opened fire as Nathaniel's force approached. The rebels had guns by now, but most had never fired one before. The exchange was brief and chaotic. Several of Nathaniel's followers were wounded, one killed. The white defenders held the house, and Nathaniel made the tactical decision to bypass it and continue toward Jerusalem. But the delay had been costly. More armed white men were gathering, organizing into militia units. The element of surprise was gone, and the rebels' advantage in numbers meant little when facing trained men with better weapons and defensive positions. That evening, as darkness fell again, Nathaniel's force made camp in the woods near the Ridley plantation. They had traveled in a rough circle through the county, and they were now closer to where they had started than to Jerusalem. Morale was breaking down. Some of the men wanted to continue the attack, to push forward no matter the cost. Others wanted to flee, to disappear into the woods and try to escape to the north. A few whispered about surrendering, though everyone knew that surrender meant certain execution. Nathaniel spent the night moving among his followers, trying to keep them committed to the plan. He reminded them of the visions, the signs from God, the divine mandate they were fulfilling. But his words rang hollow even to him. The rebellion was failing, and he knew it. The white population was organized now, armed and furious. The element of surprise, the only real advantage the rebels had ever possessed, was gone. If you're feeling the tension of this moment when everything Nathaniel Turner planned began to unravel, take a second to hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries. Subscribe and turn on notifications because stories this intense don't appear everywhere. Now let's see how a rebellion born from prophecy descended into desperate survival. Tuesday morning, August 23rd, brought disaster. Nathaniel attempted to reorganize his followers and make a final push toward Jerusalem. But overnight, most of his force had melted away. Men slipped into the darkness, heading back to their plantations in hopes of claiming they had been forced to participate, or fleeing into the swamps and forests to hide. By dawn, Nathaniel commanded fewer than 20 men. They attempted one more attack on the Blunt plantation, hoping to rally support and gather more weapons. But the plantation was ready for them. Armed white men had gathered there, having learned of the rebellion and prepared a defense. The ensuing fight was brief and one-sided. The rebels were routed, scattered into the woods in a complete collapse of organization. Nathaniel tried to regroup, to gather the remnants of his force for another attempt. But it was hopeless. By Tuesday afternoon, he was moving through the woods with only a handful of followers, and even they were beginning to question whether continuing was worth the inevitable consequences. The rebellion that was supposed to spark a general uprising across the South had collapsed in less than 48 hours. The white response was immediate and overwhelming. Militia units from Southampton, Sussex, Isle of Wight, and Nansemond counties converged on the area. Federal troops from Fort Monroe were dispatched. Naval units patrolled the waterways to prevent escape by boat. Within days, Nearly 3,000 armed white men were searching Southampton County for rebels. What followed was a reign of terror that, in its own way, rivaled the violence of the rebellion itself. White militias killed any black person they suspected of involvement, often without trial or evidence. Estimates vary, but between 1 and 200 African Americans were killed in the week following the rebellion. Men who had nothing to do with Nathaniel's uprising, slaves who had remained loyal to their masters, free blacks who had no connection to the events at all. Heads were mounted on poles along the roads as warnings, bodies were mutilated and displayed. The captured rebels faced swift military tribunals. No defense was offered, no mercy expected. 16 men were hanged in Jerusalem over the course of several weeks, their bodies left swinging from the gallows as public warnings. Dozens more were sold to plantations in the Deep South, a fate many considered worse than execution. The state of Virginia paid compensation to the owners whose property, both the executed rebels and the dead white victims, had been lost in the uprising. But Nathaniel himself had disappeared. For 6 weeks, he evaded capture despite an intensive manhunt. He hid in the woods, moving from one concealed location to another, surviving on stolen food and what he could forage. The authorities were baffled. How could one man, in a relatively small county with 3,000 armed men searching for him, remain hidden for so long? The answer lay in the very system that had created him. Nathaniel knew Southampton County intimately, knew every path through the woods, every hiding place, every sympathetic cabin where someone might leave food or warn him of approaching militia. More significantly, many slaves protected him through their silence, refusing to reveal his location even when threatened with violence. They might not have supported his rebellion, but they wouldn't betray one of their own to the white authorities. On October 30th, 1831, a farmer named Benjamin Phipps discovered Nathaniel hiding in a cave-like depression beneath a fallen tree. Nathaniel was unarmed, weakened by hunger and exposure. He surrendered without resistance, perhaps relieved that the ordeal was finally over, perhaps still believing that God would somehow intervene even now. They brought him to Jerusalem in chains, and the entire county turned out to see the man who had terrified them for 6 weeks. Contemporary accounts describe Nathaniel as calm, almost serene, showing no fear or regret. When asked if he regretted the rebellion, he replied simply, "Was not Christ crucified?" His trial lasted 1 day. The verdict was never in doubt. On November 5th, 1831, Nathaniel Turner was hanged in Jerusalem, Virginia. According to some accounts, his body was dissected and pieces distributed as souvenirs. His skin was reportedly made into coin purses and book covers. His skull allegedly passed through several hands before being lost to history. But the execution of Nathaniel Turner didn't end the story. In many ways, it only deepened the mystery of what his rebellion really meant and what truths it revealed about the nation that both created and denied him. Before his execution, Nathaniel sat in his jail cell and dictated his story to Thomas Ruffin Gray, a local lawyer who saw an opportunity to profit from publishing the condemned man's testimony. Gray titled the resulting document, "The Confessions of Nat Turner," and it remains one of the most controversial primary source documents in American history. Reading Gray's account raises more questions than it answers. How much of it represents Nathaniel's actual words, and how much was filtered through Gray's own prejudices and commercial interests? Gray framed the confession as a warning to other slaves and proof that educated slaves were dangerous. But Nathaniel's voice, assuming it's his voice, comes through with unsettling clarity and complexity. "You have asked me to give a history of the motives which induced me to undertake the late insurrection," the confession begins. "To do so, I must go back to the days of my infancy." Throughout the document, Nathaniel describes his visions with the certainty of genuine religious experience. The Holy Spirit appeared to him in the fields. God spoke to him directly, commanding him to take up arms against his oppressors. The signs in the sky, the eclipse, the strange coloration of the sun, were clear divine messages that the time had come. But the confession also reveals moments of calculation and planning that sit uneasily alongside the religious fervor. Nathaniel chose his followers carefully, planned his route strategically, made tactical decisions about timing and targets. Was he a religious fanatic driven by visions, or a calculating revolutionary using religion as a tool to inspire and organize? The truth likely encompasses both. A man genuinely convinced of his divine mission, but also pragmatic enough to plan its execution carefully. What's conspicuously absent from Gray's published confession is any real exploration of Nathaniel's motivations beyond the religious framework. The document mentions slavery only in passing, as if the conditions of bondage were incidental to the uprising rather than its fundamental cause. Gray wanted to present Nathaniel as a religious madman whose violence stemmed from fanaticism rather than legitimate grievance. Acknowledging the systematic brutality of slavery would have undermined that narrative. Yet even through Gray's filter, the reality seeps through. Nathaniel describes watching his father escape to freedom when Nathaniel was a child, never to return. He mentions being prevented from marrying the woman he loved because they belonged to different owners. He references countless small humiliations and larger cruelties witnessed throughout his life. The religious visions may have been real to him, but they grew from soil fertilized by 30 years of systematic dehumanization. The publication of the Confessions of Nat Turner sent shockwaves throughout the South. It sold thousands of copies, making Gray a substantial profit while simultaneously terrifying white Southerners with its depiction of an educated, articulate slave capable of organized resistance. The document became Exhibit A in arguments for stricter control of slaves, for laws prohibiting teaching them to read, for increasing surveillance and punishment. But the confession also became something else. Proof that slaves were not the contented, childlike beings that slavery's defenders claimed them to be. Here was a man who could read and write better than most white Southerners, who could quote scripture with the precision of a trained minister, who could organize and lead a complex military operation. The very existence of Nathaniel Turner and his testimony contradicted every assumption slavery was built upon. Virginia responded with a wave of restrictive legislation. Laws prohibiting slaves from assembling for religious services were strengthened. Penalties for teaching slaves to read became more severe. Free blacks faced new restrictions on their movements and activities. The entire structure of slave control was tightened, with Southampton County serving as the example of what could happen if vigilance ever relaxed. But the legislation couldn't address the deeper questions the rebellion raised. Throughout the South, slave owners looked at their own property with new suspicion. The loyal servant who had worked faithfully for years, could he be planning something similar? The religious slave who preached contentment and obedience, was he secretly gathering followers? The trusted house slave with access to the family, would she rise up in the night? These questions had no answers, and that was perhaps more terrifying than the actual violence. Nathaniel Turner had shown that slaves were capable of organized resistance, that they could plan and execute a coordinated attack, that the entire system of control depended on a fragile balance of force and fear that could be disrupted by a single determined individual. In the decades following the rebellion, Virginia authorities worked systematically to minimize, reframe, and ultimately bury the true story of what happened in Southampton County. Official records were edited, eyewitness accounts were suppressed, and a carefully constructed narrative replaced the complex reality. The process began almost immediately after the executions ended. Governor John Floyd ordered a comprehensive review of all documents related to the rebellion, ostensibly to understand what had happened and prevent future uprisings. But the real purpose became clear as certain testimonies disappeared from the official record, as witness statements were clarified to align with preferred narratives, as inconvenient facts were quietly omitted from published accounts. The Virginia General Assembly convened a special session in December 1831 to address the rebellion. The debates that occurred behind closed doors revealed deep divisions among the state's political elite. Some delegates argued that the uprising proved slavery was fundamentally unstable and should be gradually abolished. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, the former president's grandson, proposed a plan for gradual emancipation that gained surprising support among Western Virginia delegates who owned few slaves and resented the political power of the Eastern plantation class. But the Eastern delegates, representing the heart of Virginia's slave economy, fought back ferociously. They argued that the rebellion was an aberration caused by excessive leniency. Too much freedom of movement for slaves, too many religious gatherings, too little surveillance. The solution wasn't to question slavery itself, but to perfect the mechanisms of control. They warned that any public discussion of emancipation would be interpreted by slaves as weakness and would inspire more violence. The pro-slavery faction won decisively. Not only were emancipation proposals rejected, but the very record of the debate was suppressed. The official legislative journal made only brief, vague references to discussions about the recent disturbances. Detailed accounts of the arguments for gradual emancipation were excluded from published records. Virginia wanted no written evidence that its political leadership had even considered ending slavery, lest such evidence embolden abolitionists or inspire hope among the enslaved. The authorized version emphasized several key points. Nathaniel was a religious fanatic, driven mad by his own intelligence and the foolish indulgence of masters who taught him to read. The rebellion was a senseless outbreak of violence with no legitimate political or social motivation. The rebels were savage and irrational, killing indiscriminately without purpose or plan. Most importantly, the uprising had no support among the wider slave population, proving that the vast majority of slaves were content with their condition. This narrative served multiple purposes. It absolved Virginia's slave-owning class of responsibility for creating conditions that might drive people to violent resistance. It reinforced arguments for stricter control while simultaneously denying that slaves had legitimate grievances. It transformed Nathaniel from a revolutionary leader into a cautionary tale about the dangers of educating slaves and allowing them religious freedom. The medical community participated in this narrative construction in particularly disturbing ways. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a prominent physician, published papers arguing that slaves who attempted to escape or rebel suffered from mental illnesses he termed drapetomania and dysesthesia ethiopica. These pseudoscientific diagnoses pathologized resistance, transforming the natural human desire for freedom into a medical disorder requiring treatment through increased labor and physical punishment. Nathaniel Turner became a case study in these fabricated conditions, his intelligence and leadership reframed as symptoms of mental disease rather than evidence of capability. Churches throughout Virginia responded with coordinated messaging designed to reinforce slave compliance. Ministers preached that the rebellion proved the dangers of misinterpreting Scripture, that Nathaniel had twisted God's word to justify sin, that true Christianity demanded obedience to earthly masters. Bible passages emphasizing submission and patience were emphasized, while passages about liberation and justice were carefully avoided or reinterpreted. The Virginia Baptist Association issued formal statements condemning the rebellion and recommending increased religious instruction for slaves, but only instruction carefully controlled by white ministers teaching approved doctrines. But the official narrative couldn't entirely suppress alternative accounts that circulated among the enslaved population throughout the South. In whispered conversations in slave quarters, Nathaniel Turner became a different kind of figure. A man who had struck back against oppression, who had shown that resistance was possible, who had proven that slaves were not powerless victims, but potential agents of their own liberation. The stories that circulated bore little resemblance to Thomas Gray's published confession. In slave narratives, Nathaniel's religious visions were validated rather than pathologized. He became a prophet in the biblical sense, a man chosen by God to deliver his people from bondage, whose failure wasn't a judgment on his mission, but simply proof that the time wasn't yet right. The violence of the rebellion was reframed as righteous judgment, comparable to God's destruction of Egypt or the Israelites' conquest of Canaan. These weren't comfortable narratives, but they provided meaning and dignity to people denied both. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in 1838, later wrote about how Nathaniel Turner's name was spoken in the Maryland slave quarters where he grew up. His name was whispered in terror by the masters and in admiration by the slaves, Douglass recalled. We knew that a man had risen up, and that gave us hope even in our darkest hours. Douglass noted that slaveholders' attempts to suppress Turner's memory had the opposite effect, making him into a legendary figure whose story grew larger with each retelling. The specific details of the rebellion might have been distorted over time and distance, but the essential message survived. One man had fought back, and it had taken 3,000 armed troops to stop him. Stories circulated about Nathaniel's supernatural powers, that he could read thoughts, predict the future, survive gunshot wounds, communicate with spirits. These embellishments, while historically inaccurate, served important psychological functions for the enslaved community. They transformed Nathaniel from a failed rebel into an almost mythological figure whose power exceeded what white authorities could contain. The long-term impact on Virginia's slave system was profound, even if officially denied. Slave patrols became more frequent and more violent, with regular nighttime inspections of slave quarters looking for forbidden items like books, weapons, or maps. The surveillance of slave gatherings intensified dramatically. Any religious meeting required a white observer present at all times. Slaves found traveling without written permission faced immediate and harsh punishment. Any sign of education or leadership ability in a slave became grounds for suspicion and often for sale to a plantation in the Deep South, where the slave would be isolated from familiar surroundings and support networks. The economic impact was measurable, despite attempts to minimize it. Insurance rates for male slaves between the ages of 15 and 40 increased by an average of 30% throughout Virginia and neighboring states. Plantation owners who had previously allowed slaves relative freedom of movement now implemented strict accounting systems tracking every slave's location at all times. The cost of maintaining control, more overseers, more patrols, more administrative oversight, reduced the profitability of slavery in Virginia, contributing to the state's gradual shift towards selling slaves to the Deep South rather than maintaining large plantations. Agricultural productivity in Southampton County declined noticeably in the years following the rebellion. Many of the county's most experienced field workers had been executed, sold away, or so traumatized by the violence and its aftermath that their efficiency decreased. Several plantation owners abandoned Southampton County entirely, selling their property and relocating to areas they perceived as safer. Real estate values dropped sharply and took nearly a decade to recover. These economic consequences were rarely acknowledged publicly, as they contradicted the narrative that the rebellion had been a brief, contained incident with minimal lasting impact. Ironically, these increased restrictions probably prevented future large-scale rebellions by making organization effectively impossible, but they couldn't eliminate the fear that pervaded white Southern society. The nagging suspicion that beneath the surface of apparent docility lay the possibility of violence. That fear shaped Southern society in ways large and small, contributing to the siege mentality that would ultimately lead to secession and civil war 30 years later. For the enslaved population, Southampton County became a reference point, a moment when the impossible had briefly become real. Nathaniel Turner's name was spoken carefully, often in code, but it was spoken. Songs incorporated veiled references to his rebellion. Stories were passed down through generations, changing in the telling, but maintaining the essential narrative. Once, a man stood up and fought back. One song that emerged in the 1840s, documented by researchers decades later, contained the lines, "Old Nat Turner, He got free, showed us all what we could be. Though they caught him in the end, freedom's got another friend. The song was sung at funerals, at weddings, during corn-shucking competitions, any gathering where slaves could briefly create their own cultural space away from white supervision. The lyrics varied by region, but the essential message remained constant. Nathaniel Turner's attempt at liberation, however unsuccessful, represented a triumph of human dignity over systematic oppression. The historical evidence of the rebellion's impact appears in unlikely places. Slave insurance rates increased significantly throughout Virginia after 1831, with some insurance companies refusing to cover male slaves in certain age ranges at any price. The prices paid for male slaves decreased relative to female slaves, as buyers worried about purchasing potential rebels. Laws regarding the interstate slave trade were modified to prevent the importation of slaves from northern states, where they might have been exposed to abolitionist ideas. Import taxes on slaves were adjusted to discourage bringing in slaves from Africa or the Caribbean, where revolutionary traditions were stronger. The entire economic and legal structure of slavery adjusted itself in response to those 48 hours in Southampton County. State legislatures throughout the South passed laws explicitly referencing the recent disturbances in Virginia as justification for new restrictions. South Carolina made it illegal for free blacks to return to the state after traveling outside its borders. Georgia prohibited slaves from learning any trade that might give them excessive independence. Alabama banned all religious gatherings for slaves unless supervised by white observers. These laws, passed in states hundreds of miles from Southampton County, demonstrated how thoroughly Nathaniel Turner's rebellion had shaken the entire system of Southern slavery. In the North, abolitionists reacted with a complex mixture of horror at the violence and recognition that Nathaniel's action represented a logical response to systemic oppression. William Lloyd Garrison published his first issue of The Liberator in January 1831, 8 months before the rebellion, and the events in Southampton County gave urgent credibility to his warnings about the consequences of continuing slavery. Garrison walked a careful line in his response to the rebellion. He condemned the violence while arguing that slavery itself created the conditions that made such violence inevitable. "What we have long predicted has come to pass," he wrote in September 1831. "The slaves have risen in bloody rebellion. The guilt rests not with them, but with those who have held them in chains and denied them every human right. Those who make peaceful progress impossible make violent revolution inevitable." This response outraged Southern readers and made Garrison's name synonymous with dangerous radicalism throughout the slave states. Several Southern states offered rewards for his capture and trial. Georgia offered $5,000, an enormous sum, for anyone who would bring Garrison to the state to face charges of inciting insurrection. These reactions validated Garrison's tactical approach. The rebellion had made the slavery debate impossible to ignore. For many Northerners who had been indifferent to the slavery question, Southampton County made the issue impossible to ignore. The violence was too dramatic, the implications too clear. Newspaper accounts, even those filtered through Southern editorial perspectives, revealed the desperate circumstances that had driven the rebellion. Northern readers learned about families separated by sale, about brutal working conditions, about slaves denied basic education and religious freedom. The rebellion became a catalyst for growing Northern opposition to slavery's expansion, even among those not ready to embrace immediate abolition. The rebellion also influenced the development of pro-slavery ideology in ways that would shape Southern culture for decades. Southern intellectuals began constructing elaborate arguments defending slavery as a positive good rather than a necessary evil, directly in response to the threat Nathaniel Turner represented. If slaves were treated well and were content, men like Nathaniel couldn't exist. Therefore, his existence proved that stricter control and ideological justification were necessary. This defensive reaction would shape Southern intellectual and political culture for the next 3 decades. creating the ideological framework that made secession conceivable when Lincoln's election seemed to threaten slavery's future. What really happened in Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831? The question seems simple, but the answer remains contested nearly 2 centuries later. The basic facts are undeniable. A slave uprising occurred, approximately 60 white people died, the rebellion was suppressed, and 16 rebels were executed. But the meaning of those facts, the motivations behind the violence, and the lessons to be drawn from the events remain subjects of intense debate. Was Nathaniel Turner a religious visionary, genuinely convinced he was following divine commands? The evidence suggests he believed his visions were real. The consistency of his accounts, his willingness to die for his cause, his refusal to express regret even when facing execution all point to genuine conviction. But this doesn't answer whether his religious experiences were mystical revelations or psychological responses to intolerable conditions. Perhaps it's both. Perhaps the human mind, under sufficient stress, creates the visions necessary to justify actions that rational thought alone cannot motivate. Was he a political revolutionary using religion as a tool to inspire followers? His careful planning, his strategic thinking about routes and targets, his awareness of the broader political landscape all suggest a calculating intelligence at work. The rebellion wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of violence, but a coordinated military operation with specific objectives. Yet this calculation doesn't contradict his religious conviction. Many revolutionary movements throughout history have combined spiritual certainty with practical strategy. Was the violence justified? This question haunts any honest examination of the rebellion. The killing of children, of women who had shown kindness to slaves, of small farmers who owned no property and wielded no power. How can these deaths be reconciled with any moral framework? Nathaniel's answer, echoed by many subsequent revolutionaries, was that the oppressor class could not be divided into innocent and guilty individuals. The system itself was the enemy, and everyone who benefited from it, even passively, was complicit. This logic has been used to justify revolutionary violence throughout history, and it remains as troubling now as it was then. Yet the question of justification cannot be separated from the question of slavery itself. A system that treated human beings as property, that separated families at will, that enforced compliance through violence, that denied basic human rights and dignity. What response to such a system could be considered inappropriate? If Nathaniel Turner's violence was unjustified, what form of resistance would have been justified? The historical record shows that peaceful resistance by slaves was met with violence, that attempted escapes resulted in torture and death, that even the most basic assertions of humanity were punished brutally. The trial records and contemporary accounts reveal a deliberate effort to erase certain aspects of the rebellion. The extensive slave support network that kept Nathaniel hidden for 6 weeks is mentioned only briefly. The number of slaves who protected him through their silence is never calculated. The possibility that his rebellion inspired future resistance, even if that resistance took different forms, is carefully denied. These absences in the historical record are as revealing as what was included. Thomas Gray's Confessions represents the primary source for understanding Nathaniel's motivations, but it's a deeply problematic document. Gray had financial incentives to sensationalize the account, political motivations to frame it in ways that supported slavery, and personal biases that inevitably shaped his transcription. Reading the confession requires constant awareness that we're seeing Nathaniel Turner through multiple distorting lenses: his own self-presentation, Gray's editorial filter, and the expectations of the contemporary audience. Yet even accounting for all these distortions, a coherent portrait emerges. A highly intelligent man trapped in a system that could never acknowledge his humanity, who transformed his rage and despair into religious certainty, who convinced himself and others that divine sanction justified horrific violence, and who followed his convictions to their logical conclusion despite knowing it would end in his death. This portrait doesn't resolve the moral questions his actions raise, but it makes them comprehensible in ways that simple narratives of fanaticism or pure evil cannot. The physical evidence of the rebellion has largely disappeared. The farms where the violence occurred have been rebuilt, sold, and transformed. The tree where Nathaniel hid has long since fallen and decayed. The courthouse where he was tried has been replaced. Even his remains were treated with such brutality and dispersed so widely that nothing remains to mark his existence. This erasure was intentional. Virginia wanted to eliminate not just Nathaniel Turner, but any memorial that might inspire future resistance. But the story survived despite these efforts. It survived in the folk memories of the enslaved population, in the fears of the white South, in the arguments of abolitionists, and eventually in the historical record that even censorship couldn't completely suppress. What do you think of Nathaniel Turner's story? Was he a prophet, a revolutionary, a murderer, or all three? Leave your comment below with your perspective. If this historical mystery fascinated you and you want more content exploring the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates stories that challenge our understanding of the past. The truth is always more complex than the simple narratives we're taught. In Southampton County today, there are no monuments to Nathaniel Turner. No historical markers commemorate where the rebellion began or where it ended. The locations of his trial and execution are noted only in specialized historical records. For nearly a century after his death, even mentioning his name in public was considered dangerous and inappropriate. This silence speaks volumes about how deeply the rebellion shook Southern society. Events that authorities want to promote are memorialized, celebrated, transformed into foundation myths. Events they want to forget are buried beneath layers of silence and erasure. The intensity of Southampton County's silence about Nathaniel Turner reveals the profound threat his actions represented. Not just the physical violence, which was terrible enough, but the ideological challenge to the entire system of slavery. Because Nathaniel Turner had proven several things that slavery's defenders needed to deny. That slaves were fully human, capable of complex thought and planning. That they understood their oppression and hated it. That they would risk everything for freedom. And that the entire system of control depended on force rather than consent. These truths made slavery morally indefensible, and the only response was to suppress them as completely as possible. The rebellion's aftershocks rippled through American history in ways both obvious and subtle. The increased restrictions on slaves that followed made the system even more cruel and totalizing. The fear that pervaded white Southern society contributed to the paranoia and defensiveness that would explode into secession in 1860. The proof that violent resistance was possible, even if ultimately unsuccessful, influenced the calculations of both abolitionists and slaves in the decades leading to the Civil War. When Union troops occupied Southampton County during the Civil War, elderly former slaves told them stories about Nathaniel Turner that had been passed down for 30 years. Some of the details had become confused or exaggerated, but the essential narrative remained. One man had stood up and fought, and for a brief moment he had struck terror into the hearts of the oppressor class. That memory had sustained people through 3 more decades of slavery, had given them hope that liberation was possible, even when it seemed impossibly distant. Modern historians continue to debate Nathaniel